My name's John Macone. I'm from the Merrimack River Watershed Council. Has anyone ever heard of that group before? A few people, thank you. Well, I'll tell you a little bit about us. You've probably seen us in the news if you're familiar with this. It's called the CSO issue, the sewage that's getting dumped into the Merrimack River. We're the folks that basically brought it to the public's attention and have been trying to get our state legislatures, both here in Mass and New Hampshire, to do something about it. Not only tell us when they're dumping the sewage in the river, but also fix these sewage plants so this stops happening. That's one of our goals. We test water, we do education, we do programs like this, all up and down the Merrimack River. So if you're interested in what we do, I'd ask you to check us out online at merrimack.org. We have some brochures out front. We also have a sign-up sheet if you want to get our newsletter and keep up with us, or check out our Facebook page. And please, if you're not a member, if you'd like to join us, we'd welcome you. We are a member-supported organization, just citizens who live in the Merrimack Valley. We want this river to be the cleanest it can. So enough of that, and let's get on with the show here. Yeah?
Silence phones.
Oh, okay, sure, yeah, silence phones if you don't mind. Thank you. So this is the Merrimack River watershed area. Just to give you a map idea, you know where we are, we're right at the mouth of it. But what you can see when you look at this is you see 2/3 of it are in New Hampshire, about 1/3 of it in Mass, and population-wise it's flipped actually, who lives in the Merrimack Valley. Just a few of the facts about it. It's 117 miles long from Franklin to Newburyport. It's the 4th largest watershed in New England. 5,100 square miles, 2nd largest source of drinking water, which is really incredible when you think about it. Anyone know what the largest source of drinking water is in New England? The Quabbin, yeah, and the Quabbin is absolutely pure, pristine, and we're dumping all kinds of stuff in our river and we're drinking out of it. So it's something to think about. I look at a map like this though and I say, okay, there's kind of lines and I see some stuff on it. It doesn't really tell me a lot about what is the Merrimack Valley and what is this watershed. So I want to take you through it so you can see where all this water that's going in front of us comes from. This is the very northernmost point. Has everyone been here up to Franconia Notch? This is really the headwaters of the Merrimack to the north. Also Mount Willie. This is the area up near Mount Washington, in the Mount Washington Valley, in the Hotel Valley, that is. The Flume, if you've been there, all that water heads right by us, right here. Eagle Lake, this is the highest source of water for the Merrimack River. You can see Mount Lafayette in the background. This is over 2,000 feet above sea level. Lake Winnipesaukee is one of the largest sources of water that is coming into the Merrimack. Waterville Valley, all that water comes down through here. Mount Monadnock to the west in New Hampshire. The eastern slope of it, if you've climbed that, all that water coming down there is coming into the Merrimack River as well. Wachusett Mountain, has anyone ever climbed that or been out there? Kind of in central Mass. Again, the eastern side of that mountain comes into the Merrimack River and the western side goes to the Connecticut. So also in the Merrimack Valley, in our watershed here, is where the marathon starts. It's also where the American Revolution starts. The Industrial Revolution started here too, all within this incredible valley of the Merrimack. So we're going to go way back to the very beginning, and we're going to go back about 12,000 years. So this talk's going to take about 12,000 minutes or more. I hope not. I'll keep it brief. So it's hard to imagine that there was a time when we were under a mile of ice here. It was a mile above our heads for a period of about 55,000 years. The earth here, where we live, was actually depressed below sea level. The weight of the ice was so heavy. And of course, the ice is a great destroyer. These glaciers, as they come through, they just rip apart everything in front of them. and push it away, and then when they melt, they completely change the landscape. And that's what you see as you go through the Merrimack Valley and beyond. But you can see where this ice sheet ended, just south of Cape Cod and across most of the United States. Water is what really causes all these changes, this enormous quantity of water that's coming down and changing the landscape. So as you go around this area, you see all of these features throughout this local area and beyond. One of the more interesting ones here, I think, is a kettle pond or a kettle lake. Anyone know where there's one in Newburyport? The Mal, yeah. Frog Pond is a kettle pond. It was formed by a melting glacier that just sat there and formed this dip in the land. Throughout our valley, you see there's a huge drumlin field through Amesbury, Merrimack, across the river into southern, back into the Andovers area, all through there. You look at the landscape and you start to think about how the glaciers formed it, and you're going to start to see these things everywhere. There's an incredible esker that's in the down by the Ipswich River as well. If you ever go to the Ipswich Audubon place down there, some incredible eskers, and those are formed by rivers that melt. The ice around them melts, and they create this ridge that you can actually walk along. So this fundamentally changes the Merrimack Valley, and probably the most interesting thing that happens from our perspective is right here. Take a look, here's the Merrimack River. Well, it's not a river at this point, nor are these rivers. They're just these enormous lakes, and they're stopped right here by all of this junk that the glaciers have pushed down, and they stop the rivers and create these enormous lakes for a very long period of time, perhaps 1,000 or more years. It's not really known how long this happened, but we all know that these became rivers that run to the sea. And so what happens with the Merrimack is really quite fascinating. It's thought that most geologists believe that the Merrimack, the valley that we know, didn't exist before the glacial period. There was no river here. So I want to show you something here. This is the largest watershed in New England. This is the Connecticut River, and you can see how it goes. It kind of goes straight out to the ocean. The next biggest is the Penobscot. It's up here. It comes straight down to the ocean. And next is the Kennebec. It does the same thing. Now let's go to our river. Here it is, coming straight down. Whoops. But carry your eye down. Where does it go? It goes to Boston, and that's where it's believed that most geologists believe the Merrimack River originally deposited into Massachusetts Bay and created that Boston Harbor area that we know today. In fact, there is a submerged underground riverbed that runs through Arlington and Cambridge and that area. If you're familiar with Fresh Pond, that neighborhood, that's part of this ancient Merrimack River watershed that disappeared when when the lake broke. The water went this way instead of coming down here. So you can kind of see it when you look at, you can kind of picture some of these things today if you have an eye for it. Particularly if you go to, say, Manchester, New Hampshire. If you come into Manchester off of 93 and you come down off one of the exits, you kind of come onto a ridge and you look down and you see that Manchester is at the bottom of a valley. And that valley was actually an enormous riverbed, a lake bed originally, that runs through there. And you can see it through here. Here's the Merrimack River Valley and this huge bed of a lake that was in here. Get into Massachusetts and it gets a little more complicated. It comes in right around here. And you can see that perhaps it could go through here, but now there's quite a bit of sediment and eskers and hills all through this area that have cut it off and forced it to kind of wend its way through our valley area now. So we're going to go forward all the way to when us humans showed up. And we came in not too long after these glaciers started to disappear. At least 10,000 years ago. People are starting to follow the receding of the glaciers, and they're looking for game, and they're looking for food. And one of the best places to find food is at a waterfall, at a falls, because as the fish are trying to get up, they're going to stop right there, and then they're going to fight their way up. So great place to set up your camp and try to catch your food. So the very oldest one in New England, the very oldest spot that's been found for this, in fact, the oldest continuously occupied human location in all of New England is on the Merrimack River. It's in Manchester, New Hampshire, at Amoskeag Falls. Has anyone ever been to Amoskeag Falls? Very large natural falls. It's over 50 feet that it drops. And this is actually a dam now, but this is where the falls was, all through here. And these two archaeological sites were found right around here. It's interesting, they were found, the first one was found where this bridge is right here, and it was thanks to a citizen who, the state was putting in a highway, and they thought, well, we better check this out. Let's get an archaeologist in there. There was an amateur who came in, and they did some digging, and this guy got really interested, and he kept digging, and he kept digging, and he found this enormous site that dates back 9,000 years. That site would have been destroyed if it wasn't for this fellow who had so much interest. So we're going to go forward a little bit further in time to a time when the tribes are starting to change, and there's some new identities, and there's some new alliances. And the tribe that's in this region is the Wabanakis. And the largest tribe in this particular region we're in is the Penacooks. And they control the Merrimack River. And that is vital to their, not only to their survival, but also to their wealth and their power. Because rivers, throughout pretty much all of human history until perhaps 100 years ago or so, those were the highways. That's the way you got inland. That was your source of transport and food. If you controlled a river, you controlled the source of communication and everything that people depended on. And so they controlled the Merrimack all the way up from, basically from the mouth of it, well up into the White Mountains. And it was a seasonal existence on the river itself. People would move inland and move around through the valley to where the food sources are, but the river was the one constant that they were navigating up and down and creating their villages. Now, if you look along throughout the Merrimack Valley, you're going to find villages right from right here where we are, all the way up into the White Mountains. In fact, I worked at the Daily News in Newburyport for a number of years, and I was told an interesting story that everyone know where that office is, 23 Liberty Street, right downtown. Well, they were digging underneath the building. They had to put in some sort of a lower floor in it, and they hit an enormous shell heap from an Indian village. It was an Indian village in downtown Newburyport, and I guess at the time they kind of quietly packed it back up and just it's still there. Maybe somebody can check it out. But if you go along through this valley, particularly on the Salisbury side, there was quite an extensive village up into another large one that was in Haverhill. And on up the river, there's a very famous site up in Andover. This is up by where Route 93 passes over the Merrimack River. This is an interesting example to give you an idea that the Indians weren't really just here. They were transporting, they were trading all over the United States. And this is a copper spearhead. It was found in Merrimack Port about 100 years ago or so. Now, copper doesn't exist around here. The closest place to find copper is Ohio. So this came from Ohio and through trade made its way out here. So big change comes in 1628. The Puritans arrive here in Mass Bay, and you probably know this story pretty well, what happens. Probably the most devastating thing that happens out of this is before the Puritans arrive, there's a lot of trade that's going on with Indians. There's people who are looking for pelts. There's fishermen here, and they're making contact with Indians. Indians don't have immunities to the diseases that are being brought over. It's thought that up to 90% of the Indian population died within a very short span of about 2 or 3 years, around 1615 or so. So by the time that the Puritans arrive, they find this beautiful land. There's a lot of cleared land here. They can see these remains of villages, but the people who live there are gone. The population is down to, it's thought maybe in the 20 to 30,000 range throughout the entire Merrimack River Valley, which was a huge decline from what it had been. So the Puritans find the same things here that the Indians were here for, and that is this incredible abundance in the Merrimack River of alewives, eels, salmon, shad, striped bass, huge sturgeon. Has anyone ever seen a sturgeon before? They're a prehistoric-looking fish. They grow to about 14 feet long. They look like a monster. You imagine seeing one of those in the Merrimack? But of course, the river's open. There's no dams, and so these fish are migrating up the river to spawn and then coming back down, and they are catching them by a bountiful. Other issue about the Merrimack having to do with the Puritans is they have a charter that's very curiously written, and it says that their land of Massachusetts extends to the headwaters of the Merrimack River and then 3 miles beyond that. So one of the first things they want to do is find out, well, where does this river go? They have no idea where it goes. So they send an expedition up very early on to try to find it. And they get to right around Plymouth, New Hampshire. Has anyone been to Plymouth? Plymouth is where the Merrimack technically begins, but it's really where two of our main rivers come together, the Pemigewasset and the Winnipesaukee. So really, the Merrimack it more heavily goes up the Pemigewasset, but unfortunately for the Puritans, they took the wrong turn, and they went up the Winnipesaukee. And they come up to Lake Winnipesaukee, and they find this enormous lake, and they say, oh, well, here's the end of Massachusetts. All right, we're going to do something. We're going to put up a monument to show this. So they carve a monument, and this thing is lost to time. And it's not until around 150 years ago when they're building a dam in where Weir's Beach is. Anyone been to Weir's Beach? Right around Weir's Beach, they come across this stone, and it has these strange carvings in it. Well, it turns out this is what it says. This was put down around 1652 to mark Massachusetts' northernmost border. Well, you know the border doesn't reach there anymore. But this is actually the oldest monument that's known in all of New England that still exists. So that was what the Puritans hoped, but the Merrimack, the Crown actually had other ideas about where the border was, and you're familiar with the border today. The border runs 3 miles north of the Merrimack River in our area, and then when we hit right around Lowell, where it dips way down, the line goes straight across, and Massachusetts was very unhappy with that. They didn't think it was very fair. I think New Hampshire liked it quite a bit, though. So this gives you an idea of how important the Merrimack was in the early map makers. So here we have 3 big rivers. Here's the Hudson, here's the Connecticut, and here's the Merrimack. And another view. The Merrimack takes center stage in this map right here. You can see, so this is 1677. By then, they have a pretty good idea of where these rivers go and what might be on. There's Lake Winnipesaukee. The Merrimack is crucial. You know, people are starting to move up the river, and you can see in Massachusetts Bay, as when you look at where these villages are, they're all related to the Merrimack, because that's the way you can get up into the interior of Massachusetts and up into New Hampshire. Newburyport, that's why we're here, is because of the Merrimack. What's different about Newburyport than, say, Salem, is that Salem has to have all of its shipbuilding materials, it's a big shipping community, has to have them all brought in from somewhere else. For Newburyport, all this stuff just comes down the Merrimack River, and so people are going up the river and they're retrieving all the materials that are needed for shipbuilding and bringing it down. But they do run into some problems. One of them is the Pawtucket Falls in Lowell. Anyone ever been there? It's quite a dramatic falls. And that's a big problem when you're trying to get wood down the river. How do you get it over these falls? Well, these Newburyporters come up with a great idea. And what they do is they create a canal. 1796, here's the river, how it goes. Here's the falls up around here. So they decide they're going to cut this canal right through here called the Pawtucket Canal. It comes down into the Concord River, and you get right around the falls. A great idea, so they were getting all their lumber around the falls, and they were able to ship up the river as well. Well, it was such a great idea, it got copied, unfortunately, for Newburyport. So here's right around where that canal is, and some Boston merchants say, hey, let's cut Newburyport out. Let's just build a canal that goes right to Boston. And that's what happened. This is the Middlesex Canal. It's been long abandoned. It's quite an engineering feat. There are pieces of it that you can still see. If you like hiking out in that part of Mass, you can find it. But this was one of the reasons why Newburyport started to go into a decline around 1815 or so. We got cut off from our best source of wood. Well, canal building becomes very important early on in the Merrimack. And this is one of these transformations of the river that we see through our history. Another canal goes in 1808, and this is at that famous Muskeg Falls. You got to get, those are huge falls. You cannot get anything over those falls. And so a canal is built around them, and later that canal becomes part of Manchester and part of its industrial history. So we'll go on to another evolution. Merrimack is crucial to moving people and moving merchandise, but now we get this new idea of, hey, we can use this water for power, to power mills. 1822, this is the very beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and the very first city in America that's built specifically as a mill city is Lowell, and that's in 1822 on the bank of the Merrimack River. And that's followed shortly after by the Nashua Manufacturing Company, 1823. 1825, there's a company that's opened in Manchester, Muskeg Manufacturing Company. So now all of a sudden we're starting to see that these canals have a use, that there's some power that's going through them. And so in Manchester's case in particular, they can use that. In Nashua, they're not using the Merrimack River, they're using the Nashua River and a smaller river that goes through there as well. Construction on Lawrence begins in 1845, and so now we have our prime industrial cities, the four biggest cities along this river, and all within a very short window of time, 20 years or so, they're all pretty much coming online. So another important thing that transforms this river is there has to be a way to make sure that power is consistent. And the way you do that in those days is you build dams. So a dam is going to be built above the canals, and it's going to, below the canals, and it's going to direct water into the canals as needed, because the mills are along the canals, and they're pulling water through sluices through their buildings, and they're powering water wheels. So this is an incredibly complicated system, but it needs to have a constant source of water. So this is the first dam that's built, and you still see basically the dam that's there today is in the same location, right above the falls. Next up is a Great Stone Dam, and that started in 1845. This was the largest dam in the entire world when it was built. It's hard to imagine today, what would it take to build a dam? They don't have any, power equipment. There's really, it's all manpower in those days. This gives you a kind of an idea. This is the Pawtucket Falls Dam, 1847. To try to imagine what it would be like to construct all of this. First of all, they have to build these canals around the river to divert water. Then they have to create a system of diversion for where the dam is going to be, and then they build the dam all by hand and then sort of rebuild everything back to the dam so that the water hits the dam again and this system works. So here's another shot of, this is construction on the Pawtucket Dam, and take a look at the size of those pieces of granite. All hand dug. This is Lowell, and if you've been to Lowell, it's really fascinating to see the extent of the canal system that's powering all of these mills. Lawrence, it's a little simpler. There's what's called the North Canal, which is still there. It's about a mile long, and the South Canal, which is on this side. It's about a half mile long. And all along them are mills. In fact, in Lawrence, if you go there and you walk along the North Canal, you'll see the remnants of these sluiceways. And you'll see these, they look like big metal sprocketed machinery. And those are the sluices that they would open and close to power the mills, so the water would come in through there, go through these mills, and then deposit out into the Merrimack, because that canal is a little bit higher water level-wise than the Merrimack. Manchester has actually two canals as well, and they're side by side going through what's part of downtown Manchester today. Anyone ever walked on Canal Street? Okay, well, that's why it's called Canal Street. It was actually a canal. So I want to give you an idea of how these mills are transforming the Merrimack River Valley. So here we are in 1840, and Newburyport is the second largest city after Lowell. So go forward to 1920, 80 years later, Newburyport's now the smallest city, and Lowell is the largest, and you have cities that have come out of nothing. Lawrence doesn't even exist in 1840, and suddenly it's the second largest city. So a huge population is growing along the river. And that leads to some other problems, and that's the next evolution, which is, what are they putting in the river? So you're probably familiar with this guy. Anybody ever read through Walden, or anyone ever read this particular book I have referenced here, A Week on the Concord Merrimack? It's interesting. It's sometimes a little hard to get through, but it's sort of a travelogue of the Merrimack with a bunch of Greek mythology thrown in. So you have to kind of weave your way through it. Anyways, this is based on a trip he takes in 1839 with his brother. So think about this. Lowell is less than 20 years old. And these are some of the things he's already seeing. Destruction of the fisheries due to dams. So there's really only one dam, major dam at that point, and that's in Amoskeag Falls. Eroded riverbanks due to all the farming. He calls it a mere wastewater, as it were, bearing little of its fame from Lowell to the sea. There's so much effluent that's already coming out at that point. And one of his more interesting comments, I think, is above Lowell, he sees that the water is yellow and it's filled with the sandy silt. So what is causing that? Well, this is what's causing it. This is the White Mountains at that time and later on. And what's going on is the White Mountains are being clear-cut, completely clear-cut. When they can't get in far enough up into the mountains, they figure out a way. They figure out a technological way to do it. They build temporary train lines to get up as far up into the mountains to tear down as many trees as possible. And so what we have happening is the landscape that for thousands of years had this thickness of trees is now completely denuded. And shortly after this happens, you start to see forest fires erupt. Enormous forest fires. Anyone familiar with the Camp Fire in California last year? You know how big it was, acreage-wise? 153,000 acres. Take a look at this. This was larger than the Camp Fire in 1 year. So this is the destruction that's being wreaked on the Merrimack River Valley, that the mountains are basically eroding into the river. And it's causing a big problem for the mills. And here's a quote right here. I want to read it. What's going on? 6,000 people out of work, major disruptions. So this is an economic issue now. It's more than an environmental issue. And environmental issues aren't really sinking in with a lot of people at that time. But there are some people who are thinking about it. These ladies were. They're part of the Appalachian Mountain Club. So the Appalachian Mountain Club is formed in Boston in 1876. People are interested in going up into the mountains. And if you've been out to the Mount Washington Hotel, you know there's a rail line that goes up through there. That's how a lot of people are getting up there. And they love the mountains, but they're also seeing all of this destruction that's going on. And they want to do something about it. And you can see they're starting to actually build into the, they're building the trail system that we know today, way back at this time. So is anyone a member of this organization, Society for Protection? Okay, thank you. Because this is really the group that gets the ball rolling. These are the people that say, okay, we have got to do something to stop this destruction. And so they begin to buy up small parcels of land, as big as they can get them, and try to preserve them. They're trying to save the White Mountains and the Merrimack River. So this is early on, 1901. And most importantly, what happens next is this fellow, John Weeks, he's a New Hampshire native, but he's a Massachusetts congressman. And he loves the White Mountains. This is his home. And he sees what's going on. He wants to change. He wants to make sure this stops. And he fights for passage of the Weeks Act. And the Weeks Act initiates the national forest system. And this is a foreign idea at that time. You know, up to that point, the government starts out by owning the land. You know, you think about the Louisiana Purchase and all the territories across the United States. Government owns the land, and then it sells it or gives it to the people. The government doesn't take the land back from the people. That's who does that? Well, it has to happen. And in fact, the New Hampshire legislature fully agrees. This has to start happening. So in 1918, the White Mountain National Forest is established, specifically to save the forest, the mountains, and the Merrimack River Valley. And today it encompasses 800,000 acres. It's one of the first national forests to be established in the United States. So they're getting a handle on what's going on upstream, but downstream it's a whole other story. 1908, things are so bad with the Merrimack that the state of Massachusetts sends its Board of Health out to study what is going on with the Merrimack. And these are some of their conclusions. They've already determined that long ago there was no way you could use this as your source of drinking water. Time it reaches Lowell, it's the fourth most polluted river in Massachusetts, and pollution has increased 40% in 5 years. Then this is common throughout the world, actually, at that time, that cities are pumping their sewage directly into the river. It's thought that rivers have a cleansing power, and so you just link all the pipes together and send them into the river, and the river takes care of it. And the woolen mills are the most serious source of pollution. It's the oils that are coming from the wool that are the problem, and it's disgusting, actually, and it gets kind of caught on the riverbanks, and it rots and it stinks, and really causes a tremendous problem. And this quote, "The Nashua and Assabet rivers are offensive to sight and smell." So it's not just the Merrimack, it's some of their tributaries. So the solutions are the woolen mills need to purify their waterways. Sewage should be pumped out to the middle of the river, not the edge. You ought to look at the river from time to time, just to make sure things are okay. And they also start to think we better start creating sewage treatment plants. Doesn't happen, but they're thinking about it. So we're going to go forward. 1948, this is when the first federal law comes into place that really is important to rivers like the Merrimack. It's the first law that puts some of these pollution controls in place, and it sets the stage for one of the next major sets of laws. We'll get to that in a moment. But just to give you an idea, this is what the Nashua River looks like in the 1960s. And people say that you could tell what the mills were making on that day by the color of the river. So here it is in red. You know, it came in yellow as well, brown. There's a section of right along the river. Nashua was particularly bad, but the Merrimack was pretty hideous at that time as well. So it's not just here. These are some shots from around the country. This is going from the 1960s into the early 70s. And most famously this one, everyone know this one. The Cuyahoga, okay, in Cleveland, catches fire. The river catches fire. And this, more than anything, is the image that causes outrage across the country, that we've got to do something to stop this. So one of the things that happens in our area is along the Nashua River Watershed Association is formed. And it's similar to the Merrimack River Watershed Council. 1969, and their goal is that they want to preserve this river, and they want to take action to try to save it. And it's not always possible for the government to do it. Sometimes you need a nonprofit to help, especially when you're crossing state lines, which is the case with the Nashua River. You have two states involved. So this is an example looking from the 60s to probably about 10 years ago, same stretch of river. And they've been very effective. This is the biggie. This is the most important thing that happens basically coming out of that Cuyahoga River fire is the Clean Water Act of 1972. There's a recognition that we've got to clean up the rivers. We have to make them healthy, and we have to pour federal money into this problem to help these communities to eliminate what's going into the river. And the idea at that point is we're going to get this done in 13 years. These rivers all across the country are going to be completely clean by 1985. That's the goal. So this gives you an idea, 1974, what's going on in the Merrimack? Okay, so here's where we're at. 125 million gallons of raw waste every day is going into the Merrimack. Almost 46 billion gallons a year. There's only one community along the entire Merrimack that has a true modern sewage treatment plant. Anyone know where it is? Yes, sir.
North Andover.
I'm sorry. Newburyport. So, Newburyport, but North Andover does come online soon after. And two communities are drawing their drinking water from the Merrimack. It's very disturbing. So that's 74. So this is the stage is set. Federal money starts to come in, and communities are starting to figure out what are they going to do to fix this problem. Well, one of the things they had actually thought about, and you're going to love this in Newburyport, is they considered constructing an enormous sewage pipe from basically from around Manchester or so that would follow all the way along the Merrimack River to Newburyport, and then they would build one sewage plant big enough for all those cities right here. That idea kind of fell apart, luckily. And they decided, well, we've got to regionalize, we've got to deal with this all the way along the river somehow, and so you start to see these sewage plants that pop up. 76, the Merrimack River Watershed Council forms, and the idea of it is that it wants to also do the same for the Merrimack as is being done for the Nashua, and study the river, educate people, test water, and also advocate for a cleaner river. So the sewage plants start to come online. This is actually the North Andover plant right here, the Greater Lawrence Sanitary District. They all start to come online. And what's interesting is that at that time, when this is happening, the federal government is paying about 90 to 95% of the cost of the infrastructure and the construction of these plants. Anyone know what the percentage is today? It's pretty much zero, yeah. So we talk about the CSO problem today, and there's a piece of your answer right there. Another thing that's going on is in conjunction with what's going on in New Hampshire with the Society for Protection of New Hampshire Forests is a lot of organizations are starting to buy up land throughout the Merrimack River watershed, and it's crucial that we protect this land that's on the riverbank or close to the river to prevent wide-scale development that's going to allow all of the leaching that comes into the river and the pollution that comes in. If we create these barriers with open land and we sort of limit development in the river valley, then we're going to help to keep the river cleaner. And that's really in some places a primary and in many cases a secondary goal of all of these organizations and more. So thousands upon thousands of acres have now been preserved by dozens of different organizations, and that's something we can be thankful for. Another thing that's going on is we have a lot of different people and organizations. They're doing cleanup, they're advocating, they're educating, they're restoring riverbanks, and that's crucial as well. You know, there's a fellow here, I hope he speaks a little bit, who was out today plogging, right? And pulled up all kinds of stuff out of the Merrimack. And that's something we need to continue to do as citizens, is to try to help to clean this river up, because we own this river. There's no particular government agency or entity that owns this river. We all own it. And what you find along it is that they're all different sorts of layers of government. They don't always work great together, and so citizens need to help to bridge those gaps. So what comes next in the evolution of the Merrimack? Well, one thing you may have seen in the news a couple of years ago is it was considered to be one of the top 10 most threatened rivers in the United States. And the reason for that is the amount of development that's going on along through the watershed, mostly in New Hampshire. Most of Massachusetts now is pretty well built out. So Massachusetts has its own problems to deal with runoff and development, but New Hampshire has an enormous amount of land that's ripe for development in the Merrimack River Valley. So that's the reason why it's on that list. Another issue probably familiar, this is CSOs. This was taken right here in Newburyport after a particularly bad rainstorm. And as you may know, rainstorms cause some of these sewage systems to become at over full capacity, and they're allowed by the EPA to dump their excess sewage directly into the river. And so what happens is it comes down this way, and we see it. Last year there was 800 million gallons that came down. That was a particularly bad year because of the rainstorms. And the EPA tells us that due to climate change, the Northeast is going to see more and more rainstorms, more severe rainstorms. So what we're going to see is more incidents of CSO pollution and also runoff from streets and lawns, all, everywhere that water comes from, coming into the Merrimack River. That's a shot of the Merrimack, just to give you an idea of a runoff issue. This is, anyone remember Tropical Storm Irene? The Merrimack ran brown for several days after that. And that storm didn't even hit here, really. It hit mostly in Vermont and across northern New Hampshire. But it caused such a deluge up there that, and so much sediment came into the river that here it is, this is at Plum Island, right down the street from us in Salisbury Beach. And you can see that plume of sediment coming into the ocean. And then lastly, it's this issue of development and how are we going to manage development along the river. Our populations will always grow, it seems, but we have to figure out smarter ways to prevent pollution from getting into the river. And there are many strategies in place to do that, but it costs money and it requires a tremendous amount of planning. So that's another challenge for the Merrimack. So that is the conclusion of the evolution of the Merrimack. And thank you. comments, yeah.
Great talk.
Thank you.
I grew up in Methuen, but I live in Portland, Maine now. And we enacted a stormwater fee to start to cover the cost of dealing with our significant CSO problem. I'm not aware of any communities in the Merrimack Watershed that have enacted a stormwater fee. Would you care to comment on, we know what it takes to clean up this problem. The science is clear, the technology is clear. What's your sense of the likelihood of getting communities to pay for it, since I don't think the feds are going to take it out?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. My thought is they probably won't be able to. You know what, I don't have a slide for this here, but to give you an idea of the CSO issue on the Merrimack, there are two communities that account for almost 80% of what's going on, and that's Manchester, New Hampshire, and Lowell. And they serve more than just those cities. They serve surrounding cities. Most of those communities don't have the money to pay the cost of what really needs to be done, $100 million or $200 million in some cases. And so what we're seeing right now is that there's interest at least in our local delegation, to try to push this problem up to the federal level and get the federal government to pay attention to what's going on. Because this is happening across the country, just like in Portland. There are, most of the older industrialized cities in the United States have a CSO problem where they're still dumping sewage. And they just don't have the money anymore to pay for it. So we're hoping that if there's a coalition of if our Congress and Senate can get together on something, maybe it's something like this. This is clean water, and this is a real need, and it's a national need.
Excuse me, my name's Art Courier. I'm with the Alliance of Climate and Environmental Stewards, and we really appreciate the stewardship that the council has brought to bear over the course of time. The little piece of paper that you were handed, I'd like to capture that specific question so that we can provide everybody with a more in-depth answer to that question via a communications back out. So we're trying to capture your questions. We may answer them just as John did. I know you probably all connect with some parts of what you've seen. I'm a member of the council. I work for Nashua Corporation. I've hiked some of those trails. We've all been connected. So it's up to us to make sure that the questions that we all have and that need to be answered from powers beyond us are in fact answered. Next question.
To what extent are the landfills along the river and the effluent that comes out of those landfills, that are some of them very old, contributing to the pollution issue of the river?
That's a good question. I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that specifically. That's something I could look into.
I know from experience working with the river in Manchester, just north of the Pawtucket Falls, that there is a major league landfill there that was leaching through the property that I worked at and right into the river, and the federal government knew what was going in there and would not allow housing to be built in the effluent tract. And, I just don't know what's happened with all of that, if anybody pays attention to it.
I'd say that's another example of a question that needs to be answered. And Lawton Hockmeister, with the Coalition for a Healthy Merrimack River, is at the lead of putting together a white paper that will involve all these questions, because until we have the answers, we've only got pieces of information. So please write down that question as well as your others.
I think if I could follow, that question is interesting because it also tells you that this issue is much more complicated than just CSOs and runoff from driveways and that sort of thing. There are so many factors across this Merrimack River Valley that need to be looked at and studied. So thank you for that question.
I thought at one point that they were looking at separating out stormwater runoff from sewage runoff, so we wouldn't have the CSOs, separating them out, using stormwater, wetlands, et cetera, more natural ways. Do you know if that's still ongoing, and has that been done at all within the Merrimack Valley?
That does happen here, yes. Are you talking about rain gardens
No, I'm talking about actual separating out.
of the pipes? Okay, yeah, a lot of communities have done that. Newburyport is one of them. Really, there's only 5 major communities in the Merrimack River Valley that haven't, and they're all our biggest cities. Haverhill and Lowell and Lawrence and Manchester and Nashua. So they all still have that problem, but they're tackling it in different ways. Nashua, for example, is an interesting way that they've done it. They've been able to store their sewage, their overflow in their system, and they've actually created an enormous sort of a holding tank for when it happens. And it's not a separated system, but what it does is once the rain goes away and things dry up, they're able to pump that back through their sewage system. And so it's less costly than separating the pipes. Separating the pipes is very expensive. You have to redesign your entire sewage system to do it. So that's a big part of the cost.
Ron, did you want to make a
I
comment?
was going to make a comment on non-point source. Oh, I'm sorry. The pollution in the river is point source coming out of the pipes, non-point source just running off the lands, storm drains, things like this. At least with the point source, you've got a pipe. We know what's going into the pipe. You can make measurements, but and you can even make measurements out of regular storm drains. But the non-point source is a real problem. Taking a look at some kind of a landfill like that, if that's leaching through the groundwater, a study on that would require wells to go in. You'd have to taking water samples out of that. You'd have to determine what the flows were to try and get any idea of what the volumes would be. And then you still would have the problem trying to block it.
We are about to look at those options in that detail.
Back in the 70s, I worked with an organization called Center for Lake Erie Area Research, and we were monitoring the recovery of the lake in the late 70s, somewhere after Cuyahoga caught on fire. Is there anyone, and what we did was, elemental analysis, total oxygen demand, total organic content, minerals, all these things were just, because I did a lot of the analysis myself at the time. So the question is there anything like that going on with the river right now? Are the universities, and this was done at Ohio State, a lot of the work, are the universities involved with monitoring the river?
There is a fair amount of monitoring that goes on, but it's not in an organized fashion. We do some. Some of the sewage plants have to do it. The EPA does it as well. The city of Newburyport does. But what you find up and down the river is that there's no real cohesion between them. So say when one of these CSO events happens, we'd like to know what's happening with the bacteria and how does it degrade as it comes down the river and where does it go, because the river is very complicated. We don't have an idea of that. And that would be something that would be terrific to do, would be to...
Not to mention you could probably locate some of the sources that may not be known. And
that's true too.
Even levy fees.
Yeah, one of the things we've been doing, the Lowell sewage plant is pretty progressive on this, and they've been doing a fair amount of monitoring through the Lowell area and below that, but they've pinpointed that there are areas that they'd like to see tested, and we're at the Merrimack River Watershed Council, we'd like to start doing that to fill in some of these gaps and also make these water tests more cohesive so that we're all testing for the same things and at the same times so that we know what's going on.
I'd just like to make a comment to your question. If you could also put your name down, because there's a project in development around monitoring the water quality from Concord to the Atlantic Ocean. It's never been done that way. There's been pieces, there's historical information, but it needs to be done going forward. So a group, including the council and this Coalition for Healthy Merrimack River are forming that project team now. So anyone who would like to help with that, please make that note on that little sheet of paper. Thank you.
Given 200 years of development,
Yeah,
not two,
yeah, it's all right.
200 years of development
Yeah.
causing current problems,
Yeah.
current developmental pressures forward, and a lack of government enthusiasm for the infrastructure element. This is one of the major elements of infrastructure, has been for 500 years. Right? Is there any practical sense of optimism this is going to be reversed?
I think there is. I think if you look at those slides from 40, 50 years ago, you look at the river back then and how bad it was and how much cleaner it is now. You know, you can swim in the Merrimack if you want, probably 90% of the time now. I mean, you couldn't do it back then. My uncle, I remember, fell out of a canoe in Lowell in the 70s, and he ended up in the hospital. And, you know, I mean, that's how it was back then. Today, you can swim. There are beaches in Lowell to swim in it. So I'm optimistic. You know, I think what's happened is we solved a big part of the problem, and I think a lot of us felt that the Merrimack was pretty clean, and we've kind of forgot about these things, but we're starting to see them again. And there's enough people who are interested, and there's a lot of media attention, and that's kind of where it starts. And then it boils up, and we're starting to see government action happening too. So it's almost like a second wave of what happened, you know, in the 60s and 70s.
There's also some thinking that some of these solutions are smaller than big, expensive solutions. We just have to think them through and be a solutions-focused approach versus a problems-oriented capturing of our time and energy.
Hi, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
I was asking about the correlation between the quantity of the water versus the quality of the water, you know, with all the dams and the water that's diverted for different uses. Can you comment on that?
That's a good question. The Merrimack is not consistent. You know, that the dams create basically, you know, we've got a very wild river down here, which is great. You know, a tidal wild river. You go up above these dams, and it's basically a mill pond. It just stops, and the water that does affect the water quality up there. You know, especially with these CSOs, the river slows down. And that's another, when we talk about water testing and these issues, of where are these problems and how can we fix them? Dams are a part of that problem. Frankly, I don't see them ever coming down because they're still being used for power at this point.
Well, do you have any comment on that? Do you have a comment on that?
What part of it? As John mentioned, the global warming is increasing the amount of fresh water that's falling into these things. So you talk about water quantity, that's kind of going up, but the dams do hold everything back. And so you've got these settling ponds out there. That's always been my question. How long, we get one of these sewer, CSO events, so you put all the bacteria in the water system, how long does it take the river to flush? Does it flush itself before the next event, or does it not? Or are we accumulating? And the quieter waters along the side, the main part of the channel may flush out, but you may have stuff residual on the sides. So I'm not sure if I answered that part of the question or not. But so my concern is the increase in rainfall. So we're going to be getting more water into the system, but that means that the CSO problems are going to be greater.
Thank you. Lon is leading a coalition white paper effort to make sure we have those facts to look at, and they're all over the place right now.
So Marion Stoddard had great success cleaning up the Nashua River. In fact, she was cited in National Geographic magazine I was wondering whether or not we had a summary of the most significant critical success factors she used to accomplish what was done in the Nashua.
That's a good question.
Excellent question.
I don't, you know, I'm not sure about that. I'm sure something like that might exist somewhere. It's a good thought.
That will be researched in concert with this white paper effort, because it is about best practices. Thank you. Would you please write that down on that piece of paper?
We talked to Kate about the Charles.
Yeah, I'd just like to bring up the issue of plastic pollution. Some of us had a cleanup today along the banks of the Merrimack, near Maudsley Pond, in the inner bend of a river where everything settles out. We pulled out a ton of trash. We pulled out 438 hook set discs. Those are today, 6 of us. And I think there is an easy solution to a lot of that problem, what we saw. We just saw tons and tons of bottle caps and little bits of plastic. I would just like to suggest that we come together and ban single-use plastics. And that's an easy solution. We used to do it, 50 years ago. I mean, there wasn't plastic wrap of absolutely everything. No, everything's disposable now, and it's just so the corporation can squeeze another penny of profit. So,
If I could add one thing to that, Clean Water Action, which you've probably heard of them, they do a lot of the physical cleaning of the Merrimack River. They go along and they put in booms and they get a lot of this garbage out of it. One thing that they've noticed is that these CSOs are the cause of a fair amount of that junk that you're finding, because it's coming off streets and it's going through sewers. People are flushing it down their toilets. And when we have the CSO events, it goes, instead of going to the sewage treatment plant where they screen it, it's going through pipes that some of them are not screened. And it comes right into the river and it just dumps mass quantities.
I'd like to also acknowledge the fact that the Newburyport High School Environmental Club is engaged in an examination of what do we need to do to eliminate plastic bottles and more plastic packaging in the city, and therefore it goes way beyond. So if anybody would like to help, be a resource to the youth, under the initiative's called Fostering Environmental Stewardship and Mindfulness. And they can use a lot of help. The school system has a lot to educate, whether you realize it or not right now. 80% of the teachers in the United States do not talk about climate change, nor do they teach anything about it. Whereas 85% of the parents want that to be happening. So hence, the more we can do to support education around topics that impact the climate and environment, the better it will be. Please write your name down on that piece of paper if you are interested. Mr. Sargent.
Thank you. I'm wondering how many people think that those, 400 discs came from a single accident in 2011, or whether it's an ongoing problem. But I did want to mention a potential solution. We did this in Boston Harbor. London is doing it now. I'm not necessarily advocating it, but what they did is they used these modern boring machines similar to what they use for drilling. And they used it also for the big dig. And you can drill a pipe that will take the water from all of the plants, in a CSO situation, and then have it go underground and then go out into the ocean, maybe several miles out, get it beyond the thermocline where it's held in the colder waters. The optics of this, I know, sound terrible, but in fact, it's worked on Cape Cod. I remember writing an article down on the Cape, and all the environmental groups were saying that this was a terrible idea to have you know, the wastewater from Boston Harbor being, you know, shipped underground out to Cape Cod Bay. But in fact, they were better off having the treated water released 3 miles or 12 miles out than the untreated water released, you know, at the mouth of the river, because it would only take 2 or 3 days to get to where on the Cape. And there's been no problems with that particular system. So again, I'm not advocating it. I see people shaking their heads, but I think it is something, and actually it sounds expensive, but it actually might be cheaper than each community having to deal with the CSO problem. So I'll just throw that out there.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Anybody? Another question? No?
All good? All right.
Round two.
Any questions are good questions.
Yeah, again, my name is Ed Sussel, again, I'm a former mayor and city council in Portland, and I would just urge you, you're here because you care about your river. We had the same problem in Casco Bay, and CSOs were killing us. For years we had to deal with it. We kept kicking the can down the road because we had to build new schools, we had to repair roads and bridges and whatnot. But the biggest problem, and this is why you're here, people thought that we'd solved the water pollution problem, right? We built the sewage treatment plant. We solved that problem. People didn't realize that we were still putting raw sewage into Casco Bay, just like the Merrimack River. So I guess I would commend you all, but remind you that once we went out into the community and had to really educate people that we're putting raw untreated sewage into Casco Bay. They didn't believe it at first. But once they came to believe it, they gradually came to understand that we had to fix it. And that the federal government is not riding to the rescue. And we had to do this on our own. So I would just urge you, and we're happy to share we ended up passing it with a unanimous vote of the city council. A few people still call it the rain tax. Anybody calls it a rain tax, you know they don't like it. But overwhelmingly it's been accepted because we recognize, the people recognize that you have to start to fix this problem. And just like no one minds paying the sewer bill, they get that, you gotta pay. I would just encourage you to consider the idea of a stormwater impervious surface fee, because in my opinion, that's the only way we're gonna get to this next phase of the problem. And you're absolutely right. I've grown up in Methuen in the 70s, you know, the river was a pretty scary place, but it still can be pretty scary after a rainstorm. And I think if we work with people, we might be able to get them to see that. So I just don't give up the ship.
Good point. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good perspective. And to that end, the group that has come together, both members of the council as well as the coalition, it's to everybody, it's not acceptable to have an unhealthy river, simply stated. Anybody have a comment? Bill made one, you can make one. There's no more questions? John, thank you for the excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you for coming.